over 150 passengers experienced vomiting and diarrhea.
Japan Airlines food poisoning.
The manager of catering for Japan Airlines committed suicide after the food poisoning incident.
344 passengers hopped on a free flight for a vacation to Paris from Japan, but that would become their worst nightmare. Imagine you're on a plane and you're having a runny stomach, but you have nowhere to turn to because the queue is too long. It's not just one person, but nearly everyone on the plane. What could turn an airplane into a flying emergency room? Was it turbulence? A technical issue? No, it was breakfast. What went wrong? How did one meal take down the whole plane? All of the travelers on board were thrilled to be there since they had recently won a trip to Paris. The majority of them were Coca-Cola salespeople, and the soft drink manufacturer had booked a flight on a Boeing 747 for the journey. The 20-hour journey consisted of 3 legs, starting at Tokyo Haneda Airport, stopping in Anchorage, Alaska for fuel, flying across the Arctic to land in Copenhagen, Denmark, and finally arriving in Paris. A crew of about 20 individuals would be responsible for caring for the passengers. Tokyo to Anchorage, the first stage of the journey, passed without a hitch. Everyone was nice and dry, warm and happy. After crossing the Arctic Ocean, the aircraft entered European airspace around dawn. An hour and a half before the plane was scheduled to land in Denmark, flight attendants cooked ham omelets as a second lunch for the passengers and crew. Earlier, sandwiches had been served as a meal. Because they had been in Alaska, the pilot and first officer on duty for the second leg of the journey were operating on a different internal clock than the plane as a whole and weren't in the mood for breakfast. They chose to have steak for dinner instead. However, omelets were heated and provided to the passengers. As the plane approached Copenhagen's Kastrup Airport, passengers were already half full. It became obvious that something was seriously wrong when they were barely 30 minutes away from landing. Nearly 150 passengers experienced a quick attack of nausea, vomiting, diarrheas, and cramps. There were not enough bathrooms available to meet the sudden surge in demand. The 2 pilots, however, were unharmed and were able to land the plane in Copenhagen quickly, despite the fact that one flight attendant was also hit. Most of the passengers required emergency hospitalization because they were in such critical condition. Yet though they hadn't yet arrived at their destination, the Paris vacation they had felt so lucky to win was turning out to be miserable. However, that was just the beginning of their problems. Sick passengers were taken for emergency medical care as soon as possible, but there was another problem. None of the doctors in Denmark spoke any Japanese, and very few of the passengers could even speak English, let alone Danish. Where could they find people who could translate? Contact Japanese restaurants in Copenhagen, which was exactly what they did. The Japanese-speaking employees were summoned to the hospital to assist during the crisis. 30 passengers aboard the aircraft were in serious condition. People quickly became ill after eating breakfast omelets, which led officials to think that this was the source of the severe food poisoning. However, they needed to investigate more before making a final determination. Who became ill also followed an intriguing pattern. The backmost passengers on the aircraft were unharmed. Everyone who contracted food poisoning, including first-class passengers, had a front-row seat. The Alaska State Health Department took charge of the inquiry. Tests made on samples of vomit, stool, and leftover ham omelets picked up a bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus, known more commonly as staph E, and high levels of toxins produced by the bacteria. The culprit was indeed the breakfast omelets, but where had the contamination come from? There were strict guidelines involving food preparation that should have made this impossible. Investigators traced the history of the breakfast meals and discovered some uncomfortable things. The meals were stored in conditions that would have made it very easy for bacteria to reproduce and produce toxins. It is advised that food be stored at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 4.4 degrees Celsius to stop the growth of bacteria, but the omelets had been stored in a refrigerator at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. The breakfasts were made, sat in the kitchen at room temperature for 6 hours, and placed in a fridge for more than 14 hours after that. But the fridge temperature was not low enough to be safe. This totals more than 28 hours of storage without the required low temperatures to maintain food safety, giving bacteria plenty of opportunity to multiply and release toxins. That's a horrible lapse from the airline's catering services. Despite the fact that these storage conditions were subpar, disease would not have resulted from them alone. the investigating team made the decision to focus on International In-Flight Catering, a division of Japan Airlines with headquarters in Anchorage, and the source of the meals. They discovered that there were 3 cooks working in the Anchorage kitchen, and one of them was in charge of making all the meals for first class and the front galley, or kitchen. There were 4 galleys on the aircraft to serve the various sections, and only the food served from the front ones made passengers ill. One cook assisted in preparing 220 of the total 354 meals served on the flight, including the omelets that used Danish canned ham. He served omelets, and 86% of those who ate them got food sickness. Speaking of a cook that has death in his hands, and I mean that literally. The cook had bandages covering 2 of his fingers. However, it came out that lesions were present behind the bandages. He knew he had blisters, and that's why he covered them up, but he didn't think they were serious enough to tell his boss about. Investigators discovered that despite being required to do so, his managers failed to attest to his excellent health. Tests showed that the staphylococcus that had made everyone sick were present in the lesions. Now that we know how long the meals were lying out and gathering toxins for, it makes sense why individuals had become sick so quickly. It just takes 100 staphylococcus to produce food poisoning. The heating of the meals did not eliminate the contamination because the poisons are heat resistant. However, more than only the cook's sickness was to blame. The entire epidemic of food poisoning would not have occurred if the omelets had been stored in accordance with proper food and safety regulations. The cause of this outbreak was a combination of the cook's staph infection, the supervisor's failure to check on his health, and the inefficient food storage. The entire situation might have been prevented if just one of those elements had been absent, or if the cook had been wearing gloves. See how fortunate everyone on that plane is merely because the pilots decided to fly around dinner time rather than in the morning. Imagine the pilots suffered the same fate. They might not have even been able to safely land the plane if they had consumed the omelets and become ill like some of the other passengers. Since this occurrence, many airlines have adopted a new catering policy requiring cockpit crew members to consume meals made by different personnel in order to avoid an outbreak of food sickness that renders everyone unusable. Even though the sudden illness struck before even getting to the location, at least no one was seriously hurt, except for one man. Kenji Kuwabara, 52 years old, was the vice president of International In-Flight Cuisine and the manager of catering for Japan Airlines. In order to ascertain how the outbreak started, the investigators of the Japan Airlines food poisoning event used a very direct approach. Since no one should handle food while having infected lesions, the catering service's method must have been flawed, but even that oversight would have been missed if the food had been kept at the prescribed low temperatures consistently. This once more aimed a wounded finger at the caterer's standards. Kenji found it difficult to deal with the negative publicity, the damage to the company's name, his personal accountability as the manager of the Anchorage branch, and the embarrassment. He committed suicide in his Anchorage apartment a few days after the incident. Along with his wife and 4 children, he worked for the airline for 25 years, and many of his close friends and co-workers lamented his passing. Therefore, there's no need to postpone your trip or starve yourself while flying. Just be mindful of the dangers and reputation of your airplane catering provider. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Stay tuned.